Welcome to Natural Recovery from Suffering. This is Scott Killaby. You know, there's a lot of teachers, spiritual teachers, who either get a disease or chronic pain or deal with an addiction kind of behind the scenes or something else like cheating. This is very common, actually, cheating on a spouse. I honestly don't have any judgment towards them because, well, that's me. I had diseases and I had those kinds of thoughts. What I want to talk about is something different, is the shame that nobody talks about. In 2024, 5, whatever year this, well, it might be 26 by the time you're listening. We now know so much about disease and chronic pain and addiction and where it really comes from. Because not only is there a bunch of science saying it's coming from buried emotions, but for example, we have the tools here to prove that, to verify it. So we're in a different era here. You know, spirituality, I think, feels different to people here than it did in the old teachings because they're feeling more energetic freedom because of getting to the repression. But if you don't go the route of processing buried emotions, and let's say you get sick, you're a teacher, but you don't know that the illness, maybe because you don't read the science. A lot of teachers really don't. They give up searching for any knowledge. It's like, I'm telling you, awakening is not necessarily a healthy thing for a human being unless it's integrated, because you can really check out of a lot. I checked out of the whole world before my realization was embodied, which means it wasn't that the world fell away. I checked out of parts of it. So for example, this whole thing around science and trauma, checked out. And I almost became, I was one of those teachers. I did what other teachers do. I announced my illness. I thought that's what we do, isn't it? We get sick and then we make a public statement. And then that's it. It's as if that settles the thing. Well, see, to do that in 2025 would be to ignore the fact that we now have a lot of science saying that our spinal disorders and chronic pain and different diseases are in fact directly connected to emotional repression, and that is the bypass in spirituality. So I did it both ways. I first came out of the closet like teachers do. I have a disease. I got the requisite amount of sympathy. And then I went back into my closet. And I didn't let anybody in my life. That's how I lived. That's how they live. But when I went back into my life, instead of just hiding, I processed the buried anger that was creating my disease. And then I came back out publicly and I said, okay, footnote that disease was the buried anger that I missed on the path. And the reason I bring that up is because now I can really teach. Because those diseases and those things that stop teachers later, some teachers, are the showstopper. I mean, there are teachers that are gone off the scene. If you were here 15 minutes ago or 15 years ago, you would know some names that are missing now. And nobody knows where they're at. There's a few teachers who have died. Quite a few got sick. Not all of them. A few had some addictions. One was depressed and suicidal. Shit goes on. And we're not talking about it. And why would that happen? Because of the repression. Shame, as the research says, and your own body will show it to you, they protect us from even knowing what we've buried or knowing that something that's going on for us is coming from the buried emotions. That keeps us safe. That helps us to get love and approval. And you would say, by a teacher? Yes, because the ego, the roots of it are in the body. And a lot of these spiritual practices don't get to it. So it's actually not that much of a stretch to assume that a teacher out there who had a bypassing way in their own practice and their own teaching got sick because of what they bypassed. But that's not very popular to say. As one person said, well, Scott, you don't want to kick someone when they're down. Yeah, I know that feeling because people used to kick me when I was down. It was the most helpful thing. It happened 3 times. My best friend and my partner basically said, in one way or another, you're full of shit, you repress emotion in their own way. And then when I really didn't hear that fully, because we can be stubborn, even if we're teachers, around what suffering really is and where it's coming from, there was a lady online. See, I did the announcing of my disease. I have spinal stenosis. Here came the people. Thousands of them, very helpful actually, super helpful, that helped me stay out of work for a month, and they gave me money. It was beautiful, actually, and I really needed it. But I was also in a place where I had no idea it was buried anger. Not really. I might have had an inkling, but I didn't want to face it. So after I announced my disease, some lady triggered me. And this is why we stay in repression, because we're triggered when somebody suggests it. That's why we can't get free, a lot of us. But she said, Scott, but what if that's an emotional issue and not really a physical issue? I'm like, what was my response to her? I was quiet. That's an anger repressor's response. It was a quiet trigger. And I couldn't express that to her, that I felt shame, but I couldn't actually be conscious of it. It just shut me down. And it stuck with me. That's how things like that are. And then I think it just stayed with me, and I started to process buried anger eventually. Sometimes we have to come out of the closet just to come out of the closet, just to hear other people's perspectives, even if we don't agree with it, because left to our own device, we'll just stay in repression and suffer and totally bamboozle ourselves so we can get love and approval, not for being sick, for being a good person, a peaceful person, or whatever. And then the sick is just like another added layer. It's like, I'm a good teacher. I've helped a lot of people. Look at me now. They don't ask for it. We don't ask for sympathy. But I'm telling you, if you really understood the science, this whole thing would look different to you. A lot of people just don't know that the science is there, and their spiritual teachers don't talk about it. So when their teacher gets sick or cheats on the wife, it's kind of a silent affair a lot of times. It's like, well, here's the statement from the teacher about the illness, and then I guess it's done after this. Nothing else to say. I saw one teacher do that, just kind of put the whole thing to rest. And that's fine. Everybody has a right to privacy. At the same time, we lead thousands, if not millions of people. Collectively, we do. All these teachers. When you add it all up, I got 100,000 on my site. There's 100,000, a million here, a couple million here. After a while, you see the influence that we have, not over the whole world, but over certainly a segment of the population who has bought into some of the things that we've offered, but has not experienced the freedom that we really are pointing to. And a lot of us haven't. If we're not going to process buried emotions, how's that going to happen? It doesn't matter how many spiritual things we say. The science is the science, and our bodies are our bodies, and the facts are the facts. I'm not talking about the scientific facts. I'm talking about the facts in our direct experience that we can discover, conditioning that's discoverable in our bodies that tells us that the repression creates suffering. It is no longer in dispute. You might stay safe by thinking it's just science, and then you can somehow dismiss that. But when you dismiss your body, you dismiss the repression. And that's what we teachers do. We dismiss because we stay safe. We dismiss because we get love. When you walk up to us and you question us on that, on whether trauma or repression is under this, we might dismiss you. But we'll do it with a sleight of hand. We will do it in awareness talk, non-dual speak. And we don't know that we're dismissing you because we don't know that we're dismissing ourselves. When you feel gaslit, we don't realize we're doing that to ourselves. If we could open to the buried emotions, we would have no problem with your question. We would probably offer more of ourselves on the topic. But if we have repression, we can't, and that's the shame. And so shame and the avoidant attachment, put those two things together, you got a teacher who's not transparent and authentic and doesn't know why. Because the anger and the hurt are buried, and the teacher's really peaceful or good and dismissive, but passively sometimes. There's a lot of non-dual teachers who are like anger repressors who have this anger at the surface, and they'll use the pointing in a kind of passive-aggressive way to gaslight people, but will never admit it. And I know because I did that. See, there's a real rage at the core of a lot of peaceful people on Earth. And you have to look to see how the aggression is being expressed or held back before you would ever know it. But it has to do with how we influence people in relationship to not go to certain places, don't talk about certain things, and couch things a certain way, away from that core anger. And if you look at spirituality, it's like a shadow, anger is. Because here's the science over here saying, hey, buried anger is the number one contributing factor to many forms of suffering. And then you go to spirituality and it's like, buried what? Buried. What's that have to do with anything? People say this. Buried emotions. Like they're so blind to what science is saying, but they bought into the spiritual frameworks that help blind them. And they wanted that to stay safe and get love. And so when you present the truth to someone who's done that their whole life, they're not going to easily, whether they're a teacher or a student, give that position up. And that's what it is. It's a position. Non-duality is a position when there's repression because it's a landing. And a landing in our terms is that it's being driven by the repression, that there are beliefs involved that keep us safe because we're afraid to actually live and embody it. But we can't face that because to face it would be to face the fact that we have that fear of the anger or the hurt. And because we can't feel it, we don't really have to face it anyway. We can just rest as awareness or pretend like we don't have it. And then when the suffering comes, the addiction or the disease, we can just announce it and say, this has nothing to do with my awakening. I just happen to have a disease. But that doesn't comport with science at all. There's no science that would actually verify that. I mean, sure, there's some science out there that says there are other factors involved, like genetics and environment, but there is no science that says that a disease is not affected by the emotional system. So every teacher who's sick bypassed something emotionally. To think otherwise is like magical thinking. It's like projecting stuff onto people so that, we can think of them as our heroes or something. But we don't need heroes. What we need is our own power and our own authenticity, every single one of us. And if we give our power away to people who don't process their trauma, then we're getting into a trauma bond with them to stay safe. We have every right to do that. But earnestness on a path like non-duality would probably invite you to do something different. If you knew better, you would do better. That's what I learned. I didn't know better. Had I known that the buried anger was the culprit for all of this, I'd like to think that I would have. But frankly, the conditioning that I was not unlike people that I meet today who are totally they've pulled the wool over their eyes. And they can't even fathom. I mean, this is a very common response right here. This is why we can't end suffering. Big reason. Somebody comes to me and they say, Scott, I've been listening to you on podcasts, and everything that you're saying pretty much resonates, but buried anger isn't my issue. I'm like, really? Did you take our test? What test? Well, so just so you know, there's a free repression test, repressiontest.com. You can go discover whether you have the buried emotions. You can't do anything with them with that test. But knowing by checking your body, see, that helps, because then your mind can't say what this person said. So what he said was, no, I didn't take the test. I just don't feel any anger. That's a mic drop. That's a mic drop. I mean, I don't even know what to say to that. Here's what I'll say. It's repressed. It's buried. How would you know? That's the issue right there, is that when things arise to awareness, we assume that everything's arising to awareness because things are arising to awareness. We don't look into the fact that the reason things are arising to awareness is to bamboozle us as to what's buried, to actually keep us safe. We get childhood needs met, love and safety, by suffering. We need to suffer because we need to survive as a separate self until we see through that, either through death or death of the self during life, through the right way, to actually embody what you really are. It's the death of a false ego. That's not what you are. That's there because of the buried emotions. It's safer to believe you're not good enough than it is to feel and express authentic emotions to everyone you know. So you'll have to believe that stuff. When non-duality says everything's just arising to awareness, that's incredibly too safe and avoidant. No, we create these identities. We're not conscious of it, but that's no reason not to take responsibility for our suffering, that something is unconscious. It's even all the more reason, because then we can discover, no, we are creating it. And then we can change it by making it conscious. But if we never take that test, if we assume that because we don't feel a repressed emotion, that's not the driver, that's like not only burying emotions, that's burying your head in the sand and not being earnest. Like in 2025, you could go to 2 places right now and end the self-deception. You could go to repressiontest.com and find out which emotion that you bury the most. Then you could go to ChatGPT and say, what's the link between anxiety and buried emotions? And then what's the link, including show me the studies, between depression and buried emotions, between addiction and buried emotions, between relationship and buried emotions, between attachment theory and buried emotions, between mental health issues and buried emotions, between a disease. You can just keep going on, because repression creates suffering. Then, if you're on a spiritual path, pick up our book, Awake But Sick, The Myth of Immediate Freedom and the Dangers of Spiritual Seeking and Finding. So this is a book written by me and Toshi Matsunaga, where it's not a spiritual book, so it's not something that you're going to read and, well, I don't know. It's not that kind of a book. This book disrupts, I would hope, the line of books that I wrote and other teachers wrote to say, hold on, let's stop. What are we doing? No wonder people are so prolific. They're staying out of their bodies. That's why there's so many books. I wasn't in my body. Writing all these books, that's a way to stay safe from real, authentic connection in our relationship. I had to stop writing. But this book was written by the help of AI and some really good research and a co-author. So we wrote it quickly. We had something to say. It wasn't avoidance for the first time in my life. It was embodied. When I wrote this, I felt that embodiment, but I didn't write another spiritual book. I'd already done enough damage. I pointed to the science, and I pointed to my real human life and your real human life, which people in spirituality sometimes don't want to hear about because they don't want to know about their own human life. They want to escape it. So we just put it in there along with the science to say, these are the things that we're trying to escape. The science, the data, our human life, our buried emotions. Of course, you're not going to love this book if you're a spiritual seeker. We didn't write it for that reason. We wrote it to disrupt you, to interrupt what you're doing, because that's what love does. That's what people did for me. They said, Scott, you have buried emotions. You don't want to admit it because your entire ego structure is built on that. Doesn't change the fact, though. You know what I've learned is you either say this stuff to people outright or they find it out the hard way. Because there's a lot of us teachers and practices through the years that just painted this picture of oneness because we had an initial realization that wasn't embodied. A lot of teachers start teaching right after the realization when there are buried emotions and unmet needs, quite often. And then we get real busy pointing for you before we've embodied it. So we can't point for you in a way that shows you the embodiment. It's too soon. But why are we so eager? We're not eager just because we've recognized an unembodied oneness. It's not just the oneness expressing through us. We're staying safe by pointing to presence all the time. You know, pointing to presence as an initial pointer where the finger to the moon is not the moon is one thing, but the constant writing and pointing and talking about it is avoidance. Because you can't take that into your life. Have you ever tried? I tried taking that into my relationship, all those spiritual things. I was with someone who was a hurt and sadness repressor, as you guys know. So when he would get angry at me, he would let me know exactly what he thought about all my teaching. And it wasn't good. Was that nice? No. Did I tell him what I thought? No. I had anger repression. Eventually I did. My point is, there's a morsel of truth in everything. That's the truth. I didn't have any business bringing that into my relationship. The only thing I needed to discover in my relationship is who I am. And if spirituality couldn't help with that, it had to go. And eventually it had to go. That form of spirituality that kept me from processing the buried emotions had to go. It was just too distracting. You know, a lot of it, if we don't process buried emotions, we become or act codependently, but we won't take ownership of it. It's as simple as this. Let me help you with that. It sounds like you're suffering. And I can probably, we don't need to do that. For people that we love, if you're really clear and you don't have repression and you're just authentically helping, that's one thing. But when we have repression, we have a need for safety and love, and we're always trying to get that met. That's an agenda, but it's, of course, it happens all over the world. But when it happens in a personal relationship, and you know, it's like you think you're being authentic with someone, but you don't know that you're forcing something onto them from your childhood needs. That's not going to go well. Usually, unless they need love so bad that they just conform to that. But I had a partner who was like, no, I don't want your process. And that was the healthiest thing for me, because then I had to actually deal with my emotions instead of trying to do something for him. But I mean, you know, most people won't love us that much to tell us what they really think about that. So we just keep doing it, thinking that's going to lead to something authentic. But focusing on other people keeps me out of the buried anger. That's what I was doing my whole life, even as a teacher. Focusing on my partner's anger is a perfect way to do that. Call it inquiry. We never do inquiry focusing on somebody else's emotions. If we're doing inquiry to focus on helping someone else, that's not inquiry. That's codependency. Inquiry is for us. For us to look at our patterns, even including wanting to help, so that we can find the deepest and most profound, most connected freedom with ourselves and others. We can't do that when we're in other people's emotional business because we're not in ours then. Maybe that's my biggest criticism of non-duality. It purports to say, just look from your side, but it never says go down, because the whole thing you're looking at from your side is coming from something. And then that one failure to teach people to go there, from that, a whole bunch of shit gets created. These teachings and these practices and this story about people on an embodiment path. But what's really going on is people are resisting their emotions. They're human beings who are just resisting emotion. And we call it a dark night of the soul. No, that's not really what it is. If you resist your emotions hard and long enough and use spirituality to do that, it's going to get bad. It did for me. We couch it, though, in these phrases like dark night of the soul. It's romantic, it's sexy. Truth was, I wanted to die. It's not sexy. And when I realized my whole life had built up to that moment, I had held anger back as a kid, through addiction, then into recovery and into spirituality, and then I wanted to die. I was calling it a dark night of the soul to keep me safe from the reasons why. It wasn't anything about this earth. I love this life now, as I couldn't open to that anger. I love people, but I hated them at a really deep level, and I called it chronic pain and suicidal thoughts, so I could hide it from myself. And I thank spirituality for a lot of that, because I never got to deal with my trauma there. I blame myself, or I did. And that's what helped me get out of it. Because instead of just sitting there blaming myself, I found the anger towards myself, towards my teachers, towards my parents, society, that I used that I had buried to transform out of that hole, to find the power that was always here, the awakeness that was always here. That was already here, but the power was missing. The authenticity, the real sense of this is what I am, the embodiment of that. You can recognize presence and just die. I've seen people die because if trauma is there, trauma is there. I've seen people die from cancer after awakening. I've seen people suffer hard after awakening. I've seen teachers die from cancer and other circumstances. Nobody should make the promise that we can heal cancer through trauma work, but we don't even have a shot at it if we don't do trauma work, is the way I see it. Not real healing. We have to include the emotional experience in our physical diseases, is what I'm saying, because it's the very thing that we avoid in spirituality quite often, the emotional stuff, and then the diseases are being created by that. So when we say, I'm awake, but we're sick, we have some more processing to do. That's what I've learned. All of life is an inquiry. Nobody is ever done. The people who, you can always state your freedom. You should be honest. I'm really free. I have abundance and joy. But I would never say I'm done, because that's divisive. It's like saying, I have no idea. I have no idea about the future. I have no idea if I'm storing something right now. I'm earnest. I'm just not done. I think that's what it takes. I could never do that before. I always had to be safe and get love. And the way that I did it was like, well, I'm enlightened, so I'm not going to get angry, no matter what you do. That wasn't real. No, anger is included too. So is hurt, sadness. That's love. All that, everything is. It's just a hard reality, because we want to, we only want the good parts to be. Nisargadatta said that if you want to see reality, you can't just present the good parts and then hide the bad parts, as he smoked his cigarette and yelled at people in his meeting. I think he was a hurt repressor, maybe. Well, if I sound a little preachy, it doesn't come from that energy. It comes from a passion and a real love, because I'm telling you, I discovered that I hated people. That's a real thing. And I buried it in my chronic pain. So for me to feel so connected to people and so loving, the reason that's there is because I can say what I want without being afraid of losing you, whoever you are. I mean, it could be even a partner, but even people who follow this work. I think I'll leave you with this. First of all, please read our book, Awake But Sick. The link is in the description. Don't expect another spiritual book to inspire you to rest as awareness. It's inspire you to stop doing that and avoiding emotions, or rest as awareness, but process your buried emotions. It's going to disrupt your thinking. It's not going to, you know how we often look for things to like complement what we already think, like, oh, this goes along with what this one might not. It might be connected to certain things, but more like trauma stuff that you've read, it might feel different than some of the oneness talk. And that's because we're referring to embodying it. And you can't point to that. How would you ever point to the realization of true freedom where you could feel and express everything and just live your life, create, explore, fuck, love, break up, die, whatever. You just live your life, but you're free. Taxes, all of it. But you're just free in it. How do you point to it? How do you point people to that? If you can come up with a set of pointers that will point to living and embodying freedom, I'm not going to promise, but I'll be open to use those pointers. You can't point to it. And pointing is, if I could just say this for a moment, is a rather shallow, superficial thing, because it only points to what is and the awareness to which it comes. But most of what is buried and you can't point to it. And that's our potential. Thomas Hubel, Bessel van der Kolk, they're telling us that's our genuine transformation. That's our potential. That which we're not pointing to is our potential. And so we're selling ourselves short by pointing to what is. It's just safe. It's like, here's a story or an identity. Let's just point and let that be there. Yeah, because we won't have to feel the buried anger and hurt then, the fear. Well, let's do a little shadow work, but only from the mind. Right, because that's safe. Let's meditate and just be with everything. Right, because then you don't have to march in there and tell your partner how you really feel. You can just be at peace. But how's that working? Peace in your relationship rather than authenticity. You have to be that earnest to end suffering. I really mean that. You can't just believe that what you're doing is leading to real freedom, because we're driven by the need for safety and love. Being earnest means learning our utility inquiry and taking it with you to see that you meditate to stay safe. You do this to stay safe. You do that to stay safe, but you never process buried emotions to stay safe, because that's where your authenticity is. You don't get anything out of being your real self, your true self. You only get something out of suffering. Trust the suffering. If for no other reason you go take that test and you go study on ChatGPT and you read our book and you still believe that you're a qualification or you're an exception. See, some people will pick up the book and they'll read it. They'll read the book and they'll say, that's not a bad book, but that's somebody else's problem, those people who are bypassing. You might even say, I don't have buried anger because I don't feel it. Just remember that's it. That's it right there. The overlooking, constant overlooking of why you suffer, because you can't feel it. I hope this helps. Check out the link for the book. Thank you.